Hello students, welcome to this lesson on women in colonial period. We have already looked at women in ancient India and medieval India. Now I will talk about women in the colonial period. Again, if you look at the 1920s century, it is not just a simple narrative of progress, woven into this complex account of struggle, resistance, desire for independence. You also have women's struggle for emancipation, for selfhood and identity, where they acquire their own subjectivity and agency. There were so many social norms that were prevalent in 19th century, like I've already explained, right from ancient period to medieval period, we had a very patriarchal system and a social structure. But by the time we come to the colonial period, there are so many evils in our society. You had parda, because girls and women were in parda, there was not much education, there was illiteracy, there was sati, child marriage, polygamy, widows were treated so badly. Women were only confined to the domestic space, and you also had prostitution which was occurring. So, the Antapur, the inner domestic space and the outer world were two distinct spaces. Now, when the Europeans come into it, the colonizers came with this white man's burden. They are, trying to civilize the natives. They were trying to understand first their rituals, rules, religion, so that there was a feeling that unless you understand these aspects, you will not be able to govern these people properly. And it was the white man's burden to bring us into this state of civilization. The East India Company, when it came, it did bring about various laws. For the first time, you had a law banning sati in 1829. It permitted widow remarriage in 1856. The education in English was spearheaded by Macaulay's Minute in 1835. And what they, by these various rules, even Lord William Bentinck gave his full support to a class of persons who are Indian in blood and color, but English in taste and opinion, in moral and in intellect. So that was their aim, to create that human being who is very Western in his outlook, and though they continue to be Indians in blood and color. And slowly by 1857, you had universities which were set up in Calcutta, Madras and Bombay. In 1892, there were 144 colleges, 108 liberal art colleges, 28 law colleges, 4 medical and 4 engineering colleges that were set up. You had, because women were not so educated, the first set of reforms was taken up by a large number of people, both Western and Indian. You had people like William Bentinck, Macaulay, J.D. Bethune, and then you had Ram Mohan Roy, Ishwar Chand Vidyasagar, Keshav Chand Sen. And besides this, you had Vishnu Shastri, Pandit, Jyotibai Phule, Gopal Hari Deshmukh, Rana De, G.K. Deodhar. So all of them were giving lot of importance to women's education. See, this was a period where there was a big viewpoint that you can evaluate a civilization based on how it treats its women. And since women were not treated properly in Indian civilization, we were not at all cultured. And so these social reforms that came up, women's issues became a major agenda in them. And you also had a large number of missionaries who joined in, because after the Charter Act of 1813, we find that the missionaries arrived in large numbers, but they were caught in the between the imperial and the religious interests. But they introduced a large number of elementary schools, they brought in printing press, the Bible was also translated into many Indian languages. They also brought in conversion. And then you had Western women, the first nuns who arrived. You had Annie Besant, Margaret Noble, Mira Richard, Magdalene Stale. And all these missionaries, they brought in, many of them were reformers, theosophists, Indologists, Orientalists. They also tried to bring about a change, and all this led to a big social reform movement. And you had, slowly at the second level, you had a number of women who came up as part of this social reform, and slowly you had the groundwork for higher education which was set up. Women's education was emphasized in Wood's dispatch in 1854. Similarly, such sentiments were expressed in the Hunter Commission report of 1882 and the education policy of 1913. So, slowly we find that the spaces for women were now opening up at this time. Many women were joining professional courses. They were also being trained in as teachers. There was emphasis on health and hygiene, and slowly you have the new women who is emerging now in the colonial period, because education and literacy enabled at least a section of women to question the male presumptions about Indian femininity and womanhood. Women started writing about their lives, their stories, their experiences, their emotions and aspiration. The press also played a very significant role because it published a number of writings of these women. There was a lot of sharing and bonding. See, earlier what happened, women had no place to network. The only place where they could network was in family gatherings, when there is a marriage taking place, when there is a death in the family. But now, when women learned to read and write, they were having their own journals, their own newspapers, they communicated with other women with whom they were not connected in terms of relationship, but they had almost a similar ideology, and they started working towards upliftment of women. Then you had a large number of reformers like Pandita Ramabai, who started the Sharda Sadan, the Arya Mahila Samaj. You have Ramabai Ranade, who started the Mukti Mission, Seva Sadan. Sarla Devi Chaudhrani, she was the one who established the first organization for women called Mahila Atma Raksha Samiti. You had the Women's Indian Association, which started in Adyar in Madras in 1917. And there were so many women who were now coming forward as a result of these developments which took. There was slowly, women's organizations which came in. They were, they felt there was a need for equality of the sexes. They need to work for the other women who were not as fortunate as these women. And we find that in the earlier part, many of these organizations, and the same thing happened with the social reform movements also, they only picked up for reform those issues which the British pointed out as evidence of degeneration of Indian society. They were really not questioning or trying to bring about a radical challenge to the existing structures within the family and society. That was the crux of the problem, but that was something which they were not touching upon. They were all talking about women's reform. Women's status becomes a major issue. They took up issues of parda, polygamy, widow remarriage, women's education, but without trying to bring about a change in the family structure or the social structure. And slowly, however, we find that the whole women's question during this period was constructed with women as victims or heroines, which was denying them the complex personalities that they had or the agency they had. Tradition was not the site on which the status of women was being contested, but women became the site on which tradition was debated and reformulated. So, when these organizations come, they develop in different phases. During the first phase, you have between the period 1850 to 1915. The second phase, you have women's organization coming up in 1915 to 1947. And then immediately you have after independence also this continues. In the first phase, when these organizations were formed between the period of 1850 to 1915, They were only, it was primarily initiated by men who were trying to uproot the evils in our society, and it was looking upon as if women have to be reformed. And we find that many of the women who got involved in the reform movement at this period, they were related to male activists, or either they were elite, western educated, upper caste women. And they were, however, soon women took up the reins in their own hands. They tried to bring about change. You had, women like Pandita Ramabai. She was born in western Maharashtra in 1858, and her father used to encourage female education, and she decided to carry on her father's work after his death. And she started a school for child widows in 1882 in Bombay. She also started the Arya Mahila Samaj, and in 1889 the first home for widows was set up in Maharashtra, the Sharda Sadan. And then slowly we find that Congress becoming predominant. Gandhiji legitimized the and expanded the space which women had in public activities. He initiated a lot of these women into the non-violent civil disobedience movement, and there was much more women and women's organization that were participating in these spaces. They addressed many issues like parda, which they felt was a stumbling block to women's education. They also started encouraging the learning of English. Hygiene was taught. They would also send teachers at home to teach the girls to read, write, to do music and embroidery. Three very prominent organizations which came up between the period 1917 to 1927. Most of them were after the First World War. It was the Women's India Association, WIA, the National Council of Women in India, NCWI, All India Women's Conference, AIWC, and they played a major role in this period. You had, Margaret Cousin, who became a very important feminist, and she was the one of the founders of the Women India Association. And they brought out a monthly journal called Stri Dharma. Then you had, there were many difficulties, because many of the women were not willing to come out. And one of them said, she says, it is bull's work to drag out the reluctant sisters from the kitchen and persuade them to spend a few minutes at the periodical meetings. But then again you had a lot of women, Annie Besant, Ambuja Mai, and Kanuben Mehta, who did wonderful work in the area of religion, education, politics, philanthropy. And though there was a criticism that most of these organizations were very elitist in nature, they did not really include other women. That is something which could not be said about the All India Women's Congress, because you had they had large number of women. They were talking a lot about social reform. You had Sarojini Naidu, Annie Besant, Vijayalakshmi Pandit also, who were involved in this. And slowly we find that they took up the issue of education, legal reforms, violence against women, women's human rights, environment conservation and preservation. In fact, the AIWC even continues till today. It's a very premier organization working for women's development and empowerment. I would encourage you all to please check it up and see the kind of contribution which AIWC is making today. Then you had other organization called the Desh Sevika Sangh. It was a national women's voluntary organization. It was established in various regions in around 1930s. They were also demanding self-rule for women. They started by talking about banning foreign cloth, eradicating drinking of liquor, and producing khatar. They also actively participated in civil disobedience movement. And what we find, another very important reformer was Durgabai Deshmukh, and she was born in a middle class family in Kakinada in Andhra Pradesh. In fact, she became involved with the national movement at the age of 12, and she founded the Andhra Mahila Sabha in 1937, and even today it has many colleges, schools and hospitals. She fought for illiteracy, social injustice, and as a member of parliament she set up various social welfare boards, and it continues even by 1953 many of these units continued to work trying to rehabilitate women, needy women, children and disabled in that period. So, if you look at colonial period, I think it is clear from my talk that we started with a lot of disadvantage, and the Britishers were very critical of us, saying that we cannot be given self rule of government because we are not fit enough to be civilized. And then the whole social reform movement came up. Initially it was only the men who were involved, but slowly at the second level you had women who came into this reform, and then women developed their own kinds of material. They were writing journals, they were interacting with other women, lot of organizations came up, so many women played a major role, and women continued to be very important during the colonial period. But slowly now the women are coming out from that inner Antapur into the outer world. Thank you very much.